Hey guys, welcome back to Tony the Technician's channel. So today we're going to move on to installing the intake manifold. There's a few things that you'll need to do in order to prep for this. One thing is you're going to want to clean your heads where the intake manifold sits on, and then the front and back where the intake manifold also sits. You want to go over that with just some brake cleaner and a rag. Just make sure all the oil and anything that you've used on the engine is off of there, so you have a nice clean mating surface. You're going to need all of your intake manifold bolts, which should be cleaned. You want to make sure that you go through and make sure the threads on the heads are clean, and the threads on your bolts, if you're not using brand new ones, make sure those are clean as well. With this 350 and how the intake manifold bolts up to the heads, you actually have all of your center bolts, except for the four corners, that actually they bolt into the engine, but it's in the actual oil passageway and everything, so you are going to have fluids going over those bolts on the bottom. The four corner ones are actually in little holes, nothing gets to them. But when installing all of the other bolts, you're going to have 12 bolts for your intake manifold, and 8 of those are going to have oil and stuff running across them. So you want to make sure to use some sort of sealer on them. I'm just going to be using shellac on just the bottoms of the threads. It's going to be like the first 4 to 6 threads of the bolts. I'm going to make sure to put some shellac on there. Besides that, you're just going to need your, well, most intake manifolds will come with either a rubber seal for the front and back, or like this one is actually a cork one. I've never used cork. I've used the rubber ones before, but for the intake manifold that I have, and a majority of people will also tell you the same thing, do not use these seals or the rubber ones. They actually cause leaks, and instead you're just going to run a nice thick bead of sealant or RTV across the front and the back of the block. These are just garbage, so don't even use them. And then the rubber ones, they fit nice. You still get leaks with them, but then again, you also have, with age, you have dry rotting and cracking because they're rubber, and they heat and cool all the time, so that causes even more problems. So just don't even worry about them. Just use your RTV. I'm using the Permatex, the right stuff, black 1-minute gasket. It has a little handle. It creates a nice thick bead because you're going to want a nice thick bead on the front and the back. Then you want to make sure you test fit your intake manifold and gaskets before going to install everything. You don't want to lay all your RTV and sealer on your bolts and then come to find out that the crap doesn't fit. So, as I've told you guys before in my previous videos, the gaskets that I have is sealed power. I think I said Felpro in a couple videos. It is sealed power. It's part number 2603013, and it comes with 2 different type of intake manifold gaskets. You're gonna have this one, sorry, that actually has the exhaust crossover. With a lot of stock heads and stuff like that, you actually have an exhaust crossover on your heads that go through your heads and into your intake manifold. This causes a better startup in colder weather. It actually warms up your carburetor and intake runners and everything. But after the engine is warm, it's actually kind of bad. So a lot of people try and get away from the exhaust crossover unless they live in an area that has a lot of cold weather. But it also comes with this set. This does not have the exhaust crossover. This blocks the crossovers. My heads, they're not stock, but they do have the exhaust crossover. My intake manifold does not have the passageway on the bottom for the exhaust to flow through. So it doesn't matter which one I use, because the exhaust gases in the head are not going to go anywhere, since the intake manifold does not have that passageway. So I can use either one. But I would like to use these with nothing there, where this one has a hole, but the way this sits on the head, my intake runners aren't this big, and even if I do more porting, there's no way I'm getting them to this size. These are much closer and a better fit for my heads and my intake manifold, so I will be using these. So just know that if you have a similar setup, an intake manifold without the passageway and heads with the exhaust crossover, you can use either one. It doesn't matter. It's going to be blocked off. So that's what I have to say about that. And then the other thing is, these don't have any writing on them. They have the part number, but it doesn't say like this side up, or you know, like the head gaskets have. But with these type of gaskets, you do have this blue rubber seal around the water jacket passageways and the intake passageways. And the blue part with the seal is actually going to face up. That's what's going to sit against your intake manifold. The back is just flat. That is what's going to sit on your head. So it's not necessary in all applications depending on what gaskets you have, but you want to put RTV, a thin coat, around your water passageways as well, and run it down to where you're going to be running your bead across the front and back. It's not necessary if you have the gaskets that actually have a seal on the back as well, but mine does not. And it says it's not necessary with these gaskets, but I am going to do it to be safe. I don't want to run into any oil leaks or anything down, or water leaks further down. So I'm going to go ahead and put sealant around all the water passageways and everything. Just a nice thin coat, nothing like what we're going to do for the front and back seals. I have the Edelbrock RPM air gap intake manifold. It's the black powder coated one. It's like $60 more than just the regular finish. So it's up to you guys if you plan on going with this. It is a decent coat. It's very nice. But you have to determine if that extra $60 or $70 is worth the black over the normal. Because you could also, if you have a local powder coating place, you could have this done for maybe cheaper. You'd have to check out and see which one would be cheaper. I just went ahead and got the black one because it matches my engine setup. I like the way it looks. So another thing is, if you've watched my previous videos, when I got this, the Edelbrock was shaved down like this, but this part that says air gap RPM, it was not. It was still powder coated black. So I just took my Dremel and I sanded it down. It came out real nice. The part number for that is, it's actually on the intake manifold, 7501, but since it's the black powder coated one, it's 75013. That the 3 is for the color. So with the intake manifold, you will be getting a bunch of little flyers and stuff for gaskets and fuel lines and stuff like that. But it will also come with preparation and installation instructions. It will also give you the pattern on which to tighten down the bolts. This is for newer models. This is for the one that we'll be doing. So it numbers each bolt. You start from the center and you work your way out. And then it also gives you the firing order, but the torquing specs for the intake manifold bolts, which will be 25 foot-pounds. So we'll be doing that, and I believe that's it. Now I'll just show you how to prep the block and get ready for install. Alright guys, so here are the heads on the block. This center hole on both sides is what I was talking about. That's the exhaust crossover. And as you can tell on my intake manifold, it does not have the exhaust crossover. So that's what I was talking about. Now you also want to test fit your intake manifold and gaskets. This one fits much better than the other gasket because it is a much closer match to my heads than this bigger set, which, as you can tell, well, for one, you get a lot of room up here, and then there's actually a lip down here, a pretty big lip, and that's one thing I don't want because that's going to mess with the airflow. So I will not be using these ones. I will be using these. This is the blue seal I was talking about. That's going to be facing the intake manifold. So I just wanted to show you that just in case you weren't able to see it in the previous clip. But what you're going to start off with is just taking a rag and some brake cleaner, making sure this is all clean and dry of any oil or debris or anything like that. So that's already done. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my RTV and I'm just going to go around these water ports at each end, and then when I do the thin bead around it, I'm also going to put a thin bead right here. Then when I lay my gasket, I'll lay the gaskets on and I'll do a thicker bead on top of the gasket starting right here and run it down, a nice thick bead across here and up onto the other gasket side of the gasket. I'm going to do that on the back as well. I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Make sure when you're doing this, you've already test fitted everything because you only have a few minutes to get your intake manifold on because this gasket actually starts to set pretty fast. So you want a nice good seal, so you want to make sure everything's ready. I'm going to go ahead and put the shellac on the tips of these bolts and we'll be ready to go. Okay, so as you can see, I have put sealant around the passageways here and then also put a little strip that goes from the passageway down to the front and rear seal. Now I'm going to go ahead and lay my gasket on, making sure that everything lines up perfectly, and then we will get ready to run the coat of sealant across the front and rear. Okay, so now you can see that I have the intake manifold gaskets laid. Got it pressed. Make sure that there's no RTV sitting in the jackets or anything. If you do, make sure to go in there and wipe it out. Now along here, when you lay the bead and you actually set down the intake manifold, don't worry about anything squishing out because you don't want to mess with it. You want to make sure that it makes a nice good seal. So I'm going to go ahead and lay this bead. I'll show you what it looks like. I wish I could show you me actually doing it, but I can't. You wouldn't really be able to see anything. So I'll show you what it looks like after I get the front and back bead laid, and then we'll get ready to install the intake manifold. Okay, so as you can see, I have laid the front and the rear bead. It's a nice thick coat, basically as wide as the front and rear. And then you also want to make sure you ramp up onto your gasket as well, both front and the rear. Nice good seal. So from this point you have about 5 minutes to get your intake manifold laid and your bolts started. So don't be in a rush to where you mess up anything, but still don't be taking your time to where your gasket or your RTV starts to cure already. So I'm going to go ahead and try and set this up to where you guys can see me install the intake manifold, and we'll move on from there. Okay, so at this point you also want to make sure your intake manifold's already cleaned and everything's ready to be put on. So here we have the intake manifold. Grab it somewhere like this so you can set it down nice and flat, making sure everything lines up perfectly. Okay, so there you go. Everything's lined up nice and neatly. Shouldn't have a problem getting anything in. We're going to go ahead and get all our bolts put in, and then we'll get to torquing from the center out. Okay, so as you can see, I've applied the shellac to just the tips of the bolts, and it's going to be for these 4 center ones and the 2 towards the center on the outside, but you're going to leave the very outside 4. I mean, you could apply it, but it's not a big deal because they go into their own separate little area, whereas all the center ones go into the passageways. So I'm going to go ahead and finish installing these bolts, and then we'll get to torquing them down. Okay guys, so I just got done just putting the bolts in. Now we're going to go ahead and torque them down. Like I stated, it was 25 foot-pounds. I'm going to start off with 15 foot-pounds. You need an extension, your 9/16 socket, and possibly a swivel head for some of these on the outside. I'll just show you a couple of them. Once again, here's the pattern you're going to follow. Sorry if it's hard to see. I'll try to post a picture. If not, you can look up small block Chevy intake manifold bolt pattern. So the first one is going to be, you're going to start with the center. You're going to start with this one on this side, and then you're going to go over here, and then here, and then here, and then you're going to start on the outside, and then finally on the very outside. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the center ones. Let me see, I will need a swivel head for these. There we go. I'm going to go through and make sure they're snug. Now remember, don't be in too big of a rush. You have plenty of time now that you have the intake manifold actually on the block. So go ahead and snug everything down. Maybe if I can get my sock off. Then once you have everything snug, then you can start actually torquing them down. I have it set at 15 foot-pounds right now. So let's go ahead and start. This being number 1 over here. There's 15 foot-pounds for that first one. Then you're just going to go right across over here and start on number 2. Trying to be careful not to damage the powder coating on my intake manifold. There's 15 foot-pounds. And you're just going to keep following the sequence all the way around, 15 foot-pounds, and then go back and hit it at 25 foot-pounds. And like always, I always double check, go back around, make sure everything's still at 25 foot-pounds. I'm doing the last 4 on the very outside right now. I am going to 25 foot-pounds. Nice and slow, of course. They're all at 25, but just to make sure, I am going to go through, make sure that they are at 25 foot-pounds. Same order. And then once you get the 4 in the center, you should be able to get to the rest without the flex head. So as you can see, I am able to turn them just a little bit more before they hit that 25 foot-pounds. So you always want to go back and double check your torques. So that's it. They're all set down to 25 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to go through and make sure everything's good, everything looks good, and then I'll show you up close how the intake manifold actually settled down and created a good seal along the front and the back. But let me go through and make sure everything's good, and then I'll show you that. Okay, so there it is. Intake manifold's on. All the bolts are torqued down. This is your number 1, number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Then, since we got a nice even press on it, you worked your way from the center out. You have a nice seal. As you can see, press some of that RTV out, creating a nice clean seal. Shouldn't have to worry about oil leaking or anything like that, like when you use a normal rubber or cork gasket here. Alright guys, so there it is. That's how you install intake manifold on a small block Chevy 350. Just to recap, I went over, to make sure to clean your heads, your intake manifold, your bolts, make sure the bolt holes are clean, everything's prepped and ready, so when you lay the RTV and the gaskets, you're prepared to get the intake manifold on and torqued down. So I went over, cleaning it, how to lay RTV, how much, where at, the gasket direction, what gaskets needed for what application, with the exhaust crossover or without. Then I also went into installing the intake manifold and properly torquing it down in the sequence. And that's basically it, guys. It's a pretty simple process. You just gotta take your time, make sure you get a good even coat of RTV, make sure that you have a good seal. And a lot of people recommend not using those rubber or cork front and rear seals. Just use a nice thick bead of RTV. And that's basically it. If you guys have any questions about part numbers or prices or anything like that, just go ahead and leave a comment. It is the RPM air gap made by Edelbrock. I can't even remember what I paid for it, 300 something. It's normally 2 something, but since I got the powder coated black version, it's a little bit more expensive. So if you guys have any questions, just let me know. Thank you guys for watching once again. I'll see you guys next time when we start installing the valve covers, distributor, and carburetor. Then we're basically done, guys. Then I just got to order my transmission and we'll be installing it in the car. Thank you guys.